Hey there, it's John from Heroes and Legends. Welcome to part 3 of our 5-part Modern Masters 2017 full set review. Today we're going to look at all of the black cards, we'll look at some multicolor cards, and a sprinkling of artifacts and lands as well. So if you've been watching the other videos in the series, you're kind of familiar with what we're doing at this point. We're looking at these cards from a limited perspective. We already kind of know what they do in Modern as well as Legacy and other constructed formats, so we're just going to talk about Limited today and the archetypes that they could fall into in the Limited game. Now, in the first part of the series, we went into a lot of detail about the different archetypes that the set was really designed around. Today, I don't want to do that again to keep things moving, but I will say this, since we are talking about black, a few of the archetypes that we're going to repeatedly mention will be things like blue-black instant control, black-red unearth sacrifice, Esper control with creatures, Grixis Graveyard, and Jund Sacrifice. So those are going to be the archetypes that we'll be thinking about as we evaluate each of these cards. Now, the enemy-colored archetypes, you could certainly build an enemy-colored deck. They definitely gave you the mana base to do so, but as far as the way the set was designed, the core mechanics kind of fall into those buckets. Now, quickly before we get started, if you check out the description below, you'll find some links to our Amazon affiliate store. If you make any purchases through any of those links, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel. That really goes a long way and helps us keep doing these type of videos. Also, you can find Patreon down there, another way to help support us. We're actually really close to our next Patreon goal, so if you have a moment, check that out. Having said that, we got a lot of cards to talk about. I want to get right into it. And we'll begin with Abyssal Spectre. So this is a fine, serviceable flying creature. Here's the deal with it, though. The ability for it to deal damage and force a player to discard a card. At 4 mana, it starts to get a little awkward. Just because at that point in the game, your opponent's going to start to have answers, other flyers, blockers, stuff like that. It's not quite as strong as maybe a Hypnotic Spectre, which is 1 mana cheaper. Maybe they thought Hypnotic Spectre would have been a little too fast for this limited format, so they went with the Spectre instead, and that's fine. It's still a serviceable creature. It's a nice flyer for 4, and if you can get across, it actually can be devastating. So this is a decent card, of course. You're probably thinking off the bat, blue-black instant control, because again, it's a nice little control card, helps them whittle their hand down if you can get it to work that way. But it's also fine in, like, say, a sacrifice deck like Rakdos or Jund, because if it gets to the point where this thing can't really do much for you later on in the game, your opponent has some sort of blockers or something like that going on, then you can always sacrifice it for value later on, and hopefully you got maybe at least 1 card out of their hand on turn 5 or something like that. Bone Splinters. Okay, like I mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about sacrifice outlets. The Rakdos deck is all about the unearth mechanic and sacrificing for extra value, and even the Jund deck is really all about creating a sacrifice engine, and you're going to see that as we go forward here. But this is one of those examples. Bone Splinters is an amazing sack outlet. It's phenomenal if you've ever played with this before. And take into account, too, even though black isn't directly interacting with some of the token generation colors, like, for example, Gruul, or even like the Bant decks or the Selesnya decks, there's so much of a strong mana base here that could you splash this into one of those decks? Yeah, you probably could, and sacrifice a token for some really big rewards, right? So this is a card that you can probably use in a whole lot of places. What's nice about seeing it in the Rakdos or the Jund deck is there's other payoffs for things you sacrifice, which we're going to look at in just a few moments, so you can start stacking those payoffs. Corpse Connoisseur. This is an unearthed card, so this works really well with the whole black-red Rakdos theme, but this is a great Grixis Graveyard card right here, because what happens is when it enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for a creature card and put that into your graveyard, and it has unearth, so if you happen to mill it while you're milling yourself, you can still unearth it and still get that card out of your library and into your graveyard. So that Griselbrand you opened, or whatever, you're able to just directly throw in your graveyard for basically 5, or in some cases 4 mana. That's actually awesome for the Grixis Graveyard build. Yes, it works obviously in that Rakdos deck or even the Jund deck too for value, but really this is a star in that Grixis deck. Cower in Fear. This is a nice way to kind of defend yourself against certain strategies like the token strategy from Selesnya or what have you. You might not necessarily start this out in your deck, but it's definitely a good sideboard card against certain matchups. Damnation. Alright, well here it is. Damnation finally got reprinted. It still looks a little weird to me without the Planar Chaos card frame, but I'm happy to see it. I don't know what to say about this card. Just play it. I mean, it's a panic button. If things aren't going your way, you pull the trigger. If they're going your way, you don't play it. It doesn't matter what archetype you're in. It's awesome. So, yes, play this card if you happen to open it and you're in black. You'll be happy you did. Death's Shadow. Really popular modern card right now. It saw a lot of attention 2 weekends ago at the Grand Prix, and it's a phenomenal deck. I feel like this card's maybe a tad awkward, though, in Limited, because you do have to do a little finessing to make it good. It is only a 1-drop, and later in the game, if you're a little bit low on life, it could be great for you, quite honestly, but it doesn't have evasion either, so it's a little awkward, I think, in Limited. I don't always see it making your cut. It's definitely runnable, though. Next we have Delirium Skeins, and again, this is a great card for that Grixis graveyard because for only 3 mana, you get to discard 3 cards, and you also force your opponent to do the same. That could be huge because it can really put your opponent back, number 1. Number 2, it could get that reanimation target into your graveyard. Phenomenal card, at least there, if nowhere else. Desecration Demon. This thing is a beater. Now, my mind initially goes to control decks. I'm thinking the blue-black control or perhaps Esper control because it's a cheap creature. It does a lot. You put it out and you can maybe still even hold up counter magic later in the game. That's actually pretty cool. But let's face it, no matter what build you're in, this thing is something your opponent has to find an answer to before they run out of creatures. And the deal is with this card, like, yes, your opponent does have some say in what the outcome is every combat, and I don't usually like cards like that, but for only 4 mana, and they're having to sacrifice a creature to tap this thing down at combat, and then it's also getting a +1/+1 counter on top of it, I'm okay with that. It really feels like a lose-lose situation. I mean, you could be up against an opponent that has a bunch of tokens, but even if they're sacrificing tokens, they're just eventually hurting their board state to the point where they might not even be able to win the game just to control this card. That gets crazy. Or they can simply chump block it with bird tokens if they have that. That makes it a little less effective. But again, it's still like an abyss every turn. It just eventually takes its toll if your opponent can't get rid of it. Really, really good card. Dregscape Zombie. This is great for the Rakdos decks and maybe even also for the Jund deck. It's just a cheap creature that has a real cheap Unearth ability that allows that engine to start going. 2-drops also incredibly important for you in Limited. There's times you're just simply looking for a 2-drop, and this will work in just about any deck if you needed it to. But I think this is fine for those sacrifice engines to get started. Entomber Exarch. This one's okay. Like, I do like a couple things about this card. It costs 4 for a 2/2. I don't like that. But you do have some versatility here. You can either return a target creature from your graveyard to your hand, which is kind of nice again in these sacrifice decks, whether it's Rakdos or Jund, to keep the engine going. Or you can also use it to look at your opponent's hand, and then they do have to pick the non-creature card you chose and discard it. So that can be good too. Usually that ability is not quite as good when you're talking about turn 4, turn 5. However, it can sometimes help just by letting you know if the path is clear of any counter magic or stuff like that. So yeah, this card maybe doesn't always make your build, but I think it's solid. I think I could see playing a 1-of in one of these sacrifice decks. Extractor Demon. Here's another card that does a couple different things for you. First off, it's just a nice beater. 5/5 flyer for 6. Sign me up. That's a lot of times really good for you in Limited, but it also has a real cheap Unearth. Where this kind of shines a little bit extra, though, is the fact that whenever another creature leaves the battlefield, you may have target player put the top 2 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So what that means for you is you can mill yourself if you're in the Grixis reanimation strategy, or you could, as a plan B, even maybe try to mill your opponent. Now, I don't really think the archetype is set up to do that, but it is only a 40 card deck. You're in Limited. It could be a nice fallback plan if a game goes long and things don't go your way. There's other cards like Pilfered Plans and stuff that could help you do that too, so it's always a fallback. However, this is more about milling yourself in that deck, but also, like I said, it's just a good beater, and also having the Unearth is great for the Rakdos decks as well as the Jund decks. Falcon Wrath Noble. This is another one of the Rakdos or Jund engine cards right here. Costs 4, you get a 2/2 flyer, but most importantly, whenever another creature dies, you get to drain a life, and this is common. So if you can get a couple of these on the board, and there's another card we're going to look at in just a second that basically does the same thing, it can really start to add up quick. Gnawing Zombie. As promised, here's that other card. So 2-drop, 1/3. It's a nice little blocker too. But most importantly, you pay 2, sacrifice a creature, and drain a life. So what's really awesome here, let's say, again, this is common. If you get a couple of these on the battlefield, maybe a couple of the other cards, you go ahead and pay 2, you sacrifice something. That can really get out of hand quick. I mean, that's how this engine is really intended to work. Griselbrand. All right, here's one of the big mythics. Okay, so you really want to reanimate this thing. I mean, that's where the real value is, right? Like, that's the dream. Like, you open pack 1, you just windmill slam this card, and then you pick up all the other reanimation pieces in Grixis, and you just have a really good day, right? That's what you want to happen. Now, let's say you get this in pack 3, and maybe the Grixis plan has already sailed on. Is it playable? I think there's enough mana fixing in there that it's at least on the edge of playable. I mean, I'm not worried about the 4 black because I think the fixing's so good. I'm maybe more worried about the 8 total casting cost and getting that out. If I have a slower, more methodical deck with a lot of defense, you can probably still get there. So if that's the case, I mean, it's not going to work in every deck, but I think it's possible in certain situations. But you really want to reanimate this because it is a beating if you can get this card out. Grizzly Spectacle. This fits in a couple different places again. I mean, obviously it makes sense for a control deck if you're looking at the blue-black instant control. It's a nice removal spell. But what's really cool too is when you remove the creature, the opponent has to mill based off the creature's power. So again, that mill backup plan, I guess, could work. Or in the Grixis deck, you could maybe in a pinch, if you're really backed up against the wall, destroy one of your own things and mill and try to hit a target for reanimation. Or perhaps maybe, burial rights or something like that, which, spoilers, is coming up. So that is at least a versatile way you could look at this card. And you always want to do that. I mean, try to think of both sides of the coin when you look at these cards. Grixis Slave Driver. This is fine for the Black-Red Unearth or the Jund, and maybe in some cases even the Grixis Graveyard deck. Here's what I'm thinking with this one. Maybe a one of. Like, I don't want too many of these because of the high casting cost, but 4/4. Eventually I'm going to sacrifice it to get a 2/2. It can unearth for just 4 and I'll get another 2/2 and some more value out of it. And if I sacrifice it a couple times and I have my engine going, yeah, this card can do a lot of good things, but you don't want to get like 2 of these in your opening hand, so don't go crazy with this particular card. The reason I was thinking Grixis Graveyard is just simply because if I do mill myself and it ends up there, sometimes there's some value to be had from an unearthed card in a situation like that. So perhaps a one of there would be okay too if you're desperate for something else. Inquisition of Kozilek. This card is phenomenal as an opening turn card. Like, if you play this on turn 1 or even turn 2, you know you're going to have some value there. And what's awesome is it does, again, fit into basically any archetype as long as you have room for it. It shines more in the control decks. I'm thinking blue-black or Esper control. You'll be really happy to run it there, but one of this in another deck sometimes pays off for you too. Liliana of the Veil. Here's one of the big mythics for sure. This card is incredible. So, first off, value-wise, it's up there. At one point, this was over $100. It came down over the last few months as we were getting closer to the set. I mean, it was pretty much a given that this would be in the set, and she didn't disappoint. There she is. So, if you get this, yeah, play it. You'll be happy. Just in a vacuum, she's great. You can force players to discard as long as you either discard yourself or maybe get down to no cards in your hand to get advantage that way. Or you can use this to force your opponent to sacrifice a creature, which can be very relevant against at least some matchups. And finally, you also have her ultimate, which is achievable. Where she really shines, though, is, again, Grixis Reanimation, allowing you to also discard those cards that you want to reanimate. That is awesome. She is going to be phenomenal, though. If you're in black, you'll be happy to run her no matter what. Mind Shatter. This card's always kind of funny to me because I always think of Mind Twist as being so powerful, especially with a little bit of ramp. And this is kind of like, it's okay. But this card does have some versatility to it that you don't want to disregard. First off, just making your opponent discard cards is still good. Even if it's a little slower than Mind Twist. I mean, Mind Twist is super broken. It's still good. It's going to be great in a control deck. Think about it if you're an Esper or blue-black. Secondly, though, if you're in a pinch and you need to discard cards in Grixis Graveyard, guess what? This will do it. It's not an opponent, it's target player. So don't miss those little things because, yeah, you can use this on yourself and throw that Griselbrand into your graveyard. Mortician Beetle. This was a rare in Rise of the Eldrazi and bumped all the way down to common. And again, it's just part of that Jund engine, that Jund or that Rakdos engine. You're going to be sacrificing stuff. This thing gets counters. It's a 1-drop. It's just real easy to put out early and let it build up. It doesn't have evasion. That can be a little awkward, but at some point, if you're pinging your opponent or draining them as you're sacrificing, then 1 or 2 big creatures could be enough to just put them away or at least make them chump block, and it gets kind of out of control kind of quick. Real good card for those particular mechanics anyway. Night Terrors. This one's okay. Again, it's probably more of a control card. What's nice though is a couple things. First off, even if you miss with this, it does allow your opponent to reveal their hand. It does let you choose any non-land cards, so it does have a little more reach than, say, Inquisition, even though you're paying a couple more for it, which really slows it down quite a bit. But you do exile the card. It's not a discard effect, so that's kind of nice, too, if you are against another reanimation deck or something like that. So it's a good card to sideboard in those certain matchups, but it's also runnable, I think, in a control deck. Ogre Jailbreaker. I was kind of expecting to see more of the Gates Matters cards, unless I'm forgetting one. I think this is the only one that's in the set. If you're running a fair amount of Guild Gates, which there's a good chance you will be, this is a fine creature, a 4/4 for 4, in that case is good. If you're not confident that you're going to be able to get this out with a Guild Gate, I probably wouldn't play it. Pit Keeper. This is a fantastic 2-drop to keep that Jund or Rakdos sacrifice engine going. When this enters a battlefield, if you have 4 or more creatures in your graveyard, you get to return one of those creatures from your graveyard to your hand. And if you have multiples of these, you can start cycling through these over and over again too as you sacrifice them. That actually gets kind of crazy, again, thinking that you're getting some sort of benefit when you sacrifice this. It goes to the graveyard. You're able to get it back with maybe another one. You play it again, rinse, wash, and repeat. It can get kind of crazy. Recover. This is a sorcery speed card, but it does cantrip and does let you take a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So that can be good in a lot of different situations. Of course, it makes sense when you're sacrificing a lot of stuff and you want to recycle and keep the engine going for Jund or for Rakdos. It could be good too sometimes even in the Grixis deck if you're milling yourself a little too aggressively and need to get something back. It's there for you. And really the value is there. Not only is it replacing itself, but it's also letting you draw a card on top of it. It's actually real good for 3 mana. Next we have Seal of Doom, and this is actually a fair removal spell. I mean, it's sometimes a great deterrent as well. Just putting it out on the battlefield, making your opponent think about how they're going to play their cards can be good at times. It doesn't hit black creatures. You do have to take that into account. But I do think it's still main deckable, at least a 1 of, just simply because of the multicolor aspect of this set. I expect to see cards that are not just in one color coming at you. So I think that's safe there. Just a really good card in general. It's really great with things like if you're lucky enough to open a Damnation, because you can use Damnation, sweep the board, and if this is already in play, like you play your first creature and their first creature could get sealed, that's actually kind of awesome. Sever the Bloodline. This is a really fair removal spell. I mean, the first thing you think of when you see it, when it says exile target creature and all other creatures with the same name, you're thinking about how to get rid of multiples. So this is awesome against like the Bant decks or the Selesnya decks that are running a lot of creature tokens, for example, that have the same name, and it'll be phenomenal there. But even if you're not in that matchup, it's still a really good card that exiles a target creature for 4, and it has flashback on top of it. That makes it really good, especially for either the Grixis deck. If it gets milled, you still can find value. It's great in the blue-black control decks or the Esper control decks. Really, it fits into just about anything. Don't think of it as just a sideboard card. Unburial Rites. Okay, I spoiled this one earlier, but this is an uncommon way to get your reanimation target out onto the battlefield, and that's awesome. There's 2 cards we're going to look at today that do that. This is the first one, and this can do it for 5 or perhaps 4 mana if it's in your graveyard. Yesterday we looked at Gifts Ungiven. Awesome combo. You use Gifts Ungiven to choose this card, and whenever you want to reanimate, your opponent has to put both in the graveyard, and then you just pay the white and 3, and you bring that Grizzlebrand or whatever back, and you're having a very good time at that point. So, yeah, this card's incredible. And Burial Rites, even if you're not like super all in on Grixis Reanimation, this can still be a good value card for you. It's phenomenal. Vampire Aristocrat. This is fine. I feel like there are better things to do, although it's another sack outlet. You don't want to underestimate that. It's at common, so it should be a little easier to find than maybe some others. And if that's the case, it will be just fine for you in some of these Jund or Rakdos decks. Now, the thing you want to remember, this doesn't have any sort of evasion. Like, I kind of wish it had flying. Obviously, it would probably have to cost 1 or 2 more if it did, but it doesn't, so you kind of deal with that. It's really more about keeping the engine going. Vampire Nighthawk. Here's a real solid creature that is just sometimes a removal spell. Can even gain you a little bit of life. Sometimes that matters. But all of it rolled into one for just 3 mana. It's phenomenal. It's a good control card because it's just one of those creatures that you can put out, do a little bit of damage, gain a little bit of life, and sometimes use as a removal spell. But really, it's great in any sort of deck that you can run black in, quite honestly. All right, let's move into some Rakdos cards. We're going to start off with a hybrid card, Torrent of Souls. This is a good one. If you ever played with this in Limited, you know what I'm talking about here. This is super versatile. It does a lot of stuff. If you can pour the 2 different colors into it, it's awesome. Awesome. But even if you just have one, it's still really, really good. So much like in Burial Rites, if you paid black into this, you can take a card from your graveyard and put it into play. Now, if you also put red into it, then all your creatures for that turn get +2/+0 and haste. That's awesome, right? So that card you reanimated, you can attack in right away. It gets a little boost on top of it. Or think of it this way. Maybe you're in Gruul colors and you just use the red side of it and you're going wide and you just give everything +2/+0 and attack in and maybe haste if you played something else small that turn. Really, really awesome stuff and can just put away a game for you at times. So this card's awesome. It's versatile. And even like, I'll go as far as to say the color fixing is so good in this set that you could even maybe splash this into a Bant or a Selesnya deck and get the benefit of having all your tokens attack in with a +2/+0 and win the game that way. This is an awesome card. We'll move into some gold Rakdos with Augur Spree, and this is a good card that duels as a removal spell, but also just sometimes an enhancement when your opponent doesn't block. 3 mana instant, and it can do a couple really big things for you. Just great card in general. Carnage Gladiator. I really love this in the Jund or Rakdos engine because the whole concept there is you're just slowly wearing down your opponent. And now this card shows up, and whenever a creature blocks, that creature's controller loses a life. So you're attacking in with the creatures. Even if they block them now, they're still losing life, and this regenerates. It's just really hard to deal with in that engine. Falconwrath Aristocrat. This was actually a mythic at one time. It's now a rare. So you know the power levels there. For 4, you get yourself a 4/1 haste flyer. If you sack a creature, it's indestructible to end a turn. If that happens to be a human, it gets a +1/+1 counter on top of it. There's a lot going on here. And again, it works with the whole sacrifice mechanic that you find in Jund as well as just the Rakdos deck in general. But even so, just aside from all that, it's just still a very solid card. And you're not going to find a whole lot of humans necessarily in black, but there are humans in the set. So again, the color variety is available in the mana base. You can do some interesting things there too, I'm sure, if you really put your mind to it. Cathari Bomber, another card that's really good in the Jund or Rakdos deck to help that engine along. Because again, what you're doing here, it's a 2/2 flyer for 3. It's got this weird sort of quasi drawback, but actually can be good for you where it attacks. If it deals combat damage to a player, then you have to sacrifice it, but you do get to create 2 1/1 goblin tokens, which then later you can sacrifice, and it also has Unearth on top of it. So there's a lot going on here. You could potentially get 4 goblins out of this thing, and not to mention the damage it puts across as well. That seems like a lot for 3 mana, so I think it's definitely runnable in that engine. Olivia Voldaren. This is a mythic, and she is a beating. I'm going to tell you right now. Like, first off, she's a flyer. She costs 4. She comes in as a 3/3, but if you pay a red and 1, she'll ping another target creature, which doesn't even have to be an opponent's creature if there's not one available. And then the creature becomes a vampire, but more importantly, she gets a +1/+1 counter. Then later on, you can simply pay 2 black and 3 to gain control of a target vampire, which you can turn anything into a vampire for just the 2 mana, and you have that as long as she's around and you control her. So this is just one of those cards that snowballs. Your opponent has to answer this, or else you just win the game. It's a fantastic card. You won't see it a lot being a mythic, but if you are able to play it, just regardless of whatever style deck you're in, this is definitely runnable. Spike Gesture, this is a nice kind of hasty attack creature, kind of what you think of when you think of Rakdos normally. I mean, this set is doing something very different with Rakdos, not making it the aggressive color. It's really trying to do something with a little more finesse. But here's a really kind of classic Rakdos creature, 3/1 haster for 2. So, and it's common, you can get a number of these. What's nice is maybe if you're planning on sacrificing cards, you play this first, get a little damage across on turn 2, maybe turn 3, and then later on you can sacrifice it for value when it gets outclassed. Terminate. A great removal spell. It doesn't matter what deck you're playing. If you can swing the colors, run it. It's real simple. 2 mana instant, destroy the creature, can't be regenerated. It has new art too, by the way, which is actually really nice looking. I think it's supposed to be the Sun Titan on there. Alright, let's move on to Golgari. And like I said at the top of the show, there isn't really a Golgari theme that they've created in this set, but, I mean, the diversity in the mana base is there, so really, you can think out of the box and do some probably interesting things as well, but for the most part, you're going to find here these cards are really directed to the Jund mentality, but having said that, Abrupt Decay, incredible card. Really happy to see this reprinted. This was a $9 card, actually, and that's saying something considering it was in Return to Ravnica, which was printed into oblivion, and this is a rare. So, huge modern card here. Sees a lot of play in a lot of places, and it deals with just so many threats. Oh, and by the way, it can't be countered by spells or abilities. If you get this and you're in these colors, you'll be happy to run it. It's also very splashable. Golgari Germination. Now we're going to start seeing some of the advantages of going Jund. It's an enchantment. I usually don't like enchantments that don't do anything on their own, but this only costs 3, and if you're all in on this whole Jund sacrifice mechanic, you know you're going to find value here. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you get a 1/1 green sapperling token to sacrifice for more value. Golgari Rotworm, another just very effective Jund card here. 5/4, you pay 1 black, sacrifice a creature, target player loses a life. So another way to just slowly dwindle them down on life. Oh, and by the way, it's also a 5/4 beater on its own. Putrefy, another real good removal spell. It's an instant, it costs 3. This time you have the choice of getting rid of an artifact or creature, can't be regenerated. Again, it's really efficient, really good, definitely worth splashing for in other colors even. Broodmate Dragon. Here's actually a full-on Jund card, and this is just value. Like, yeah, I can sit around and say, you know, this goes with this deck or that deck and this deck, but let's face it, you're getting 8/8 flying power toughness in the air for 6 mana. I know it's 3 different colors, but in this set, I'm not too concerned about that. This is just a beater. Like, you'll be happy all day long to play this. This could even be a decent reanimation target for you. I think it's just good enough even to use like Unburial Rites on or something like that if you needed to. Sprouting Thrinax, another Jund card that's just going to help you with that engine. When it dies, you get 3 Sapperlings. It's a 3/3 on its own. Completely makes sense there. Alright, let's move on to artifacts. A couple signets I just wanted to showcase real quick. We talked about them in a previous video, so I'm not going to go into detail, but they are good cards. Here's Golgari Signet, and here's Rakdos Signet. Let's talk about some lands, and again, we talked about Guild Gates before, so I won't go into detail, but here's the Golgari Guild Gate, and the Rakdos Guild Gate, and the Triland for Jund colors is Savage Lands, and again, this is part of the Shard cycle. And finally, last but certainly not least, Verdant Catacombs. It's the fetch land that we're going to talk about today, and again, we have discussed these in the past. I just will simply say, these are very valuable cards. They're very sought after. There's really high demand for them, obviously, especially in Modern, but other formats as well. It's a very serviceable card in Limited. It's a fantastic way to fix your mana. And on top of it, some Graveyard Matters themes will work well with this card. Some of those returning cards from your graveyard to your hand that we saw really can help you dwindle land out of your deck. And so you can find some incremental advantage over time with that too. So fantastic cycle of cards to include. Really happy to see the enemy fetches. Alright, having said that, those are all the black cards and a whole bunch of the set at this point. So we only have 2 more chapters left. We're going to come back tomorrow and look at the red cards. The next day we'll be back with the green cards and we'll finish everything up at that point. So hopefully you are enjoying this and taking something away from it. Until next time, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.